So I'll be presenting slides, which you'll see on the screen if you have access to that. Now, I'm told that you can download the slides if you just look for the handouts pane. That should give you access to the slides also, which you can download and take notes, or at a later time download it. My name's Adam Sims. I'm the forensic principal at BDO in Sydney, and we also cover Melbourne. I'm a solicitor, and before that I was a detective for 20 years, investigating criminal conduct. As a forensic specialist, I am, if you like, the corporate policeman. I always say once a policeman, always a policeman. Can't seem to get away from it. We basically at BDO Forensic investigate anything that requires some sort of fact finding around it. We follow that matter all the way to the courts if necessary. It can be anything from corruption, money laundering, fraud, or even minor matters that clients want investigating. Today, I want to focus on something that is probably a little bit more preemptive as opposed to being reactive, which investigations are, and which we are seeing as a big ticket item coming out of the many commissions of inquiries we're seeing these days in Australia, and also to ensure that you and our other clients and other businesses don't end up in the crosshairs of things like commission of inquiries or investigative bodies. So that's what I want to talk about. This is actually the fourth and last webinar in this series. For those who weren't able to attend Shane's, or Janine's presentations, they are also available on our website. The genesis, and I'll do a bit of background here just to recap, the genesis of this series came from BDO's release of its yearly landscape report. The report gathers insights from about 500 business executives across 55 countries, so it's not Australia-centric, but it's still very useful. Two, it's from a range of sectors on their perceptions of risk, or both present and future. Even if you don't decide to read it, the key themes that come out in the report, I'll just go through those quickly. Basically, we saw what came out of it was culture, governance, technology, and customer centricity, the internal forces that drive and are driven by agility and innovation come down really to the company's preparedness. The report also revealed that business leaders across the Asia Pacific and globally are feeling the effects of a riskier world, in particular with regulation producing the most powerful blindside risk. But the report did show that those businesses who are more agile and harness innovation are typically those that are more successful, albeit at some risk, which is what I want to focus on today. There was also an emphasis on the importance of external pressures and forces organisations face that can't be controlled, but there are things that can be done to shield organisations. And this is really the focus of my talk to you today, some of the lessons that I want to glean from commissions of inquiries and other lessons that you'll see me talk through as we go. For my segment, I want to focus on this concept that comes out in the report. Sorry, I'll just... Sorry, my technical abilities aren't coming to the fore here. Okay, we're on the right slide now. As I said, for my segment, I want to focus on this concept of the report called the innovation operation dichotomy, and expand on this and understand how complex it is whilst making the solutions to the problem, and I'll go through those, quite simple really. I want to take the thinking beyond the report, however, and allow you to see what I see, or what my practice sees, are the risks through a forensic lens. The report doesn't specifically deal with the forensic lens, but it certainly gleans some lessons, and too with the Australian environment as it exists. I just want to provide some insight to you today about that. What we can see from the report, going back to that very briefly, is that the surveyed executives all understand that in an age of innovation and agility, business is striving to stay ahead of the bell curve. I'm sure we all see that. That top percentile companies and the newest products, services, and advanced skills or customer understanding are the ones with the increased success and also margins to go with that. What this graph shows, though, is that executives from the survey understand that innovation doesn't need to come at the expense of operational effectiveness. And I'll let you ponder on that very briefly. I mean, it's quite distinctive where the participants are really landing in the middle there. The innovation and operational effectiveness are equally important. But what I'd like to ask and probably specify is, what do we mean by operational effectiveness? It means many things to many people. What I am focusing on when we talk about operational effectiveness is all the things that include processes that allow a company to carry on the business in a legal and compliant manner and in the interests of the market and social responsibility. And if you look at this in more depth, what the report shows is that it's actually a hard question to answer. And we'll see why a little later when I go through, where high profit margins and the win at all cost culture really do lead to unethical business practices, and we're seeing that more and more. And one would anticipate that, often, well, let me put it this way. What I am seeing is this is often concealed from management if they're not implicated. Just staying with the report very quickly, very briefly. And if we look at this slide, this is where the wheels start to fall off, or at least show the wheel nuts aren't all in place. Participants cite that the major barrier to innovation is actually internal governance and bureaucracy. Let's leave aside the bureaucracy. If our win at all costs ahead of the bell curve business believes that internal governance is affecting its ability to maintain competitive momentum, then we start seeing a breakdown in internal controls. And unfortunately, that is all too often ignored, and as I mentioned, or not known to management, who are more focused on bottom line results and performance indicators rather than company culture. And if you listen to Janine Waters' presentation, she would have spoken about the importance of company culture or entity business culture. And this is a really important area that sits alongside what I'm about to talk to today. And before you know it, suddenly there begins an erosion of the process, of the policies a company uses to ensure that its operations are effective and efficient, an erosion of the framework that ensures its financial reports are accurate and complete, and that the company is doing business in accordance with all relevant regulations and laws. This is a slippery slope, trust me on that. And as I said before, it's one that can often be concealed from the executives and management and shareholders until it's too late. And that's often where we come in and start the investigation. But how do we know this? One only needs to look at the recent commissions of inquiry to see how this happens and the resulting reputational damage that follows. Sorry, just bear with me. My technological expertise is playing again. I called this the age of commissions of inquiry, but really what I meant on reflection is this is the age of transparency. Whether they be royal commissions like the Financial Services Royal Commission, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse, or the recently announced and yet to happen Royal Commission into Aged Care, Quality and Safety. Or, even inquiries that we've seen in the past, which have been big ticket items in the media, Australian Wheat Board inquiry into corrupt conduct, Prudential inquiry into the Commonwealth Bank, and other long-standing commissions. They are unfortunately established on an ad hoc basis. I say unfortunate because the ramifications. They do inquire into matters only of public interest predominantly. And like I said, we are seeing more of that. And their purpose is usually to ascertain factual circumstances and make recommendations. They are really, in a contemporary sense, very public. They're very high profile and generally possess greater powers than those possessed by courts, not to mention the fact that they act retrospectively. If you are doing or have done something wrong, if your company is doing or has done something wrong, I should emphasise, you definitely do not want to be caught in the crosshairs of a commission of inquiry. There is little doubt that we are seeing a larger number of inquiries, and they investigate a range of issues. Historically, they would investigate matters to do with public of public interest. We're seeing more these days that they're dealing with matters of corporate malfeasance. Just as social media provides us, uncomfortably at times, I should say, with unprecedented transparency, societal norms now require us as business leaders to be transparent with all manner of things that were once not under the purview of the public. And just because lost oversight in businesses are eviscerated at the hands of poor governance, or in worst case, a cover-up. And let's remember, nobody forgets a cover-up. If I just draw your attention, if you saw it in the media, the Dover financial planning, it's a really good example of this. It was horrendous, let's even say abusive practices that led it coming under the crosshairs of the Royal Commission. With customer complaints, culture of poor controls, alleged cover-ups, it's led to a full-blown ASIC investigation, and not only that, it's led to the cessation of their business activities. The company is no more, and that's coming from a company that just prior to that was the 10th largest financial planning company in the country, with more than 400 planners, I think it was, operating under its AFSL. Phenomenal when you think about it. And just on the unprecedented transparency we're seeing, the other interesting thing that comes out, and the two that we pay particular attention to, are organisations such as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ as it's colloquially known. It's a US-based non-for-profit operating a network of global investigative journalists, some in Australia, I should say, uncovering issues of what they say is global importance. They've done some phenomenal work, and arguably two of the most important pieces of work that they've done today are, you would probably know, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, you know, where they've uncovered money laundering, tax evasion, gun running, human trafficking, and all sorts of awful practices of businesses and individuals, and not only that, well-known individuals and businesses. Their good work will continue, but at some point their focus will shift, and that I guarantee you, and it'll start looking at issues of malfeasance of a lesser scale than what it's currently looking at. The point to all this is the ability to come under the spotlight if you're a company not adhering to ethical principles and even undertaking illegality is extremely high. I'm a big fan of the AICD, the Australian Institute of Company Directors. They come out with some really good stuff. And what I'd like to say here is, don't take my word for all this. Let's look at what they have to say. Now, in a recent document they presented, the Essential Director Update, you can see the comments there that come out of that report, and I'll give you a minute to just have a look at those. Boards are showing an increasing interest in the conduct of their organisations where they haven't previously. Inquiries and leaks, like I've discussed, are changing the way boards are assessing their responsibilities, and that too of companies they oversee. A quote from the report is, boards are often ill-informed, do not have line of sight over safety policies and practices, and do not have adequate feedback loops to know what is happening. Poor practices such as inadequate government structures and failing to record and report complaints or understanding the seriousness of complaints were evident. Against this background, I guess the key takeaways, and if you take the time to read that report, which I recommend you do, the key takeaways are that boards have an important role to play in monitoring strategic risk management frameworks, policies and processes, and in setting the tone from the top. And I'll talk about that a bit later. As part of this role, boards should consider whether non-financial risks, including reputational risks, are being adequately considered and discussed at board level. Some boards are better, my observation are some boards are better than others in that regard. While there should be an expectation that management and the CEO in particular should continue to assume responsibility and accountability for an organisation's culture, boards, led by the chair, should effectively hold management into account, and they should adopt the don't tell me, show me philosophy. Now, this is coming out of the report. It would be prudent for boards and management to proactively consider their approach to crisis management. There will be no luxury of time when a crisis hits. Companies may find it helpful to play out corporate crisis scenarios and engage external experts to facilitate this. The chair may wish to be involved in this process, recognising that in the case of a reputational crisis, that is linked to culture or governance as opposed to the operational issue. The chair will often be the appropriate spokesperson for the company. So bringing that all together, and if you, commission reports are quite extensive. The Royal Commission into the financial services is at three chapters. It's only an interim report at this point. You could read thousands of pages of the inquiries and commissions findings and recommendations to date. What I'd like to focus on, what I'm talking about today, are the common themes that come out of all these inquiries that I've been researching over time. And that is these points here on the slide. There's a lack of tone from the top. There's an inability of employees and also management to identify red flags. There's a lack or poor implementation of internal reporting, poor company culture in dealing with complaints, no investigation procedures, and also poor controls. This all sounds very tragic, but really the solution is extremely simple. And I've been talking about it for many years, as have my colleagues, I know that. And I'd like to run you through exactly what we're talking about. The most effective way that you can put your business in a good place is to have a complaint and investigation process. Now, this is a very scalable offering. You should have obviously policies and procedures in place to dictate the extensiveness of this program. However, not having one in place has been proven, and I've seen it probably 98% of the frauds that I've investigated, and to the most serious frauds, where the policies and procedures around complaint management and investigation process are either non-existent, inadequate, or even if they are adequate and top shelf, they haven't been implemented correctly. So this is a key area that all businesses should focus on, regardless of how much income you bring in a year or how many staff you have. And I caveat that with, obviously, if you're a small business and you have 2 or 3 staff, you do that informally in any case, and you probably all know each other. But once you start getting beyond 10 staff, and I'm reaching out to shareholders here who have had to engage finance teams, know nothing about finance. We're seeing a lot of fraudulent activity in these areas where there's no oversight, there's no tone from the top, if you like, around this process. And the process is really simple. And once again, I say it's scalable, but each and every scalable solution comprises of these 5 steps. The initial contact, and I've got that in red because it is arguably the most important part of this program, of this process. The internal reporting, or the whistleblowing. Now, whistleblowing in almost every study you will see has been proven to be the most effective way to uncover criminal activity in your organisation or malfeasance. We can't get away from that. The other thing is, in Australia, we're seeing a change in legislation. So there's new legislation about to be released. It's just trying to find the reference to it. It's called the Treasury Laws Amendment Whistleblowers Bill 2017. It was due to be assented to in July, 1st of July, I understand. Given that the government is in a state of flux at the moment, that has now been put on hold, and we really don't know when that's going to be released, other than the fact that it is going to be released at some point. I will say this actually around the investigation and complaint process. It needs to be one of 5 things, or it needs to be all of 5 things, not just one. It needs to be fair, it needs to be confidential, it needs to be transparent, it also needs to be accessible, and it needs to be efficient. You need to wrap these things up really quickly, because if you don't, you allow investigations or complaints to exist over time, or put them on the shelf, as we've seen with many of the big 4 banks, they come back to bite you, and they do nothing for corporate culture. As I said, the initial contact is the most important, because that is really the door to this process, to this program, and it allows you to understand what is happening in your business. Now, whistleblowing hotline is what we're talking about here, I guess. We still call it a hotline, even though it exists in many forms these days. We find, we have a hotline. We operate a hotline that we find is used predominantly by someone calling a telephone number. Two, they use email contact, and a web portal is another way that people get into the whistleblowing hotline. And they lodge an allegation of a complaint that they're seeing within the business. Now, just remember what I said before. Management often don't see the behaviour that's occurring, but I guarantee you, regardless of how clandestine this activity is, there will be someone in the business that knows something. And at one point or another, there will be someone who is willing to blow the whistle. In just about every investigation I've worked on, there's been someone that's seen something. And one of my most recent ones, which was a $4.2 million fraud in a business that could ill afford it, to be honest, the suspect was on $90,000 a year and arrived to work one day in a $160,000 Mercedes-Benz. Now, people at work thought that was unusual, and they even went downstairs and took photos of it, but thought nothing more of it. In the same vein, they found gaming slips in his bin at work, purely by accident. And once again, no one thought to raise the red flag. No one understood the red flags that existed there, and nor did the company have a process for that initial contact. In fact, many whistleblowers that I speak to speak of distrust in internal reporting. So if you say to me, well, I don't need a whistleblowing service because I have appropriate internal reporting, escalation to managers, etc., you'll find that probably 80%, and I pull that from my head, but that's from experience, 80% of whistleblowing will not occur. The people who know things in your business will stay silent, and they will either move on or they will not acknowledge that they knew anything about it. You need something that's independent, that's external to your business, that allows trust to occur. I think I've said enough about that. The other stage is really a triage stage. So this often happens internally, and I mean, I don't want to go into exactly what the procedures are in this. I just wanted to flag this is a remedy to everything that's occurring out there, and it's just one of many, but it's probably the most important one. We draft these things all the time, and as I said, this is scalable depending on the size of your business, the risks associated with fraud or corruption and other crime within your business or your sector, in fact. But each procedure will have an early resolution or a formal resolution phase. The early resolution phase obviously is an informal avenue where you consider, non-serious matters, might be communication issues within your business, certainly nothing that is discriminatory or harassing behaviour, anything that becomes criminal, something that would become a breach of the code of conduct, a serious breach of the code of conduct that may result in the cessation of employment. These are really non-serious matters. I have to emphasise that. And as I said, this process needs to be concluded quickly. And this is what allows it to be concluded quickly, where we have matters that don't bog up the process. Then there will be other matters that are assessed as serious, where the initial confirmation or triage, identifies that, in fact, we suspect a crime has been committed in the business. We need to protect victims. There's assets at stake. There's evidence that requires formal investigation. And a business, again, depending on the size and complexity, will either have an internal capability or they'll outsource it to an external provider. And that's when we then move into the investigation phase, probably the most important phase. Many laws around this that make it complicated and technically complicated, and more so today. There's a lot of things like procedural fairness that need to be taken into account. So the triage phase really needs to be a hands-off assessment, and decision to go into the investigation phase, where really the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and the hands-on work starts. And as I said, this is where you have the internal or external investigative capability come in. And what we're talking about there is evidence collection, interviewing of your employees, some of your employees that might know something about what's going on, people management and control, managing controls, or other witnesses that may be either implicated or should know something that's going on. And typically you'll find an investigation, it's the fact finding that is the number one importance, because you want to find out what's going on and the facts around that. But two, it's a time to also take lessons from what's happened and understand where controls have fallen over. The previous example I gave you, that company could have had controls in place but didn't, and as a consequence they lost the amount of money I said previously, 4.2 million or thereabouts. But the investigation phase is the most important, and once again, the problem with the investigation phase when we talk about resolving these issues quickly is that it can go on and on. You really do need professionals to come in and look at it, and your internal capability should have an investigations background. They should be licensed, because then you know that they have the credentials to do that. Externally, obviously they should be licensed, but they should come from experienced personnel, and you should always ensure that if you're engaging external investigators. That allows you to resolve matters very quickly, and with focus, and come up with, at the end of it, a report where you have the facts presented and some recommendations around what has occurred. The outcome, the investigation and the outcome, so the final phase of the procedure, are two very separate, I have to emphasize, it's very separate phases. The investigation should never recommend the outcome. The outcome is on the business as to what they will do based on their internal policy, and it will use the investigation to drive what the outcome might be, but the investigator should never be asked to provide advice on the outcome. And that then becomes a disciplinary, the disciplinary phase, where either we have termination of employment or some other resolution to solve what has happened. Now, the other two things I want to talk on very quickly, and I won't keep you for too much longer because I'm going over time a little bit, are a fraud and corruption risk assessment and awareness training. Now, I call it fraud and corruption awareness training. I mean, when I deliver these two pieces of work, they often go beyond fraud and corruption. I look for any crime, and most practitioners do. But these are very important pieces of work. My client who suffered the loss I spoke about earlier, had they have done a fraud and corruption risk assessment for the sake of a nominal fee compared to what they lost, they would have saved themselves a lot of heartache and a lot of money in investigating that fraud, because it would have been stopped, and may not have occurred, in fact, had they have got in early enough. The awareness training is important for your staff because, as I said earlier, the red flags that aren't noticed or aren't understood are provided for in such training. So you might say to me, well, why should I get my staff trained in this? The simple answer to that is to be aware of what's going on in your business. It's like an extension to the fraud and corruption risk assessment, if you like. I mean, both of these pieces of work are important, and often clients and prospective clients, I should say, aren't interested in performing because they say, well, we don't have a problem. The issue with not having a problem is you don't know what you don't know until it's too late, and that can be detrimental, because then you're paying upward of $100,000 for an investigation if it's big enough, and to potentially reputational issues. That's really all I have to say. I guess the key takeaway to all this is that really, if you don't have measures in place around good governance, around your corporate culture, or ensuring that your corporate culture is one that follows controls, follows governance, you can really come unstuck. And the unfortunate aspect to that is the environment of being agile, the environment of being innovative, potentially does lend itself to shortcutting governance requirements. The research shows, and if you read the report, the research shows that it does not mean to follow governance procedures. It does not mean that you will not be an agile business. In fact, I would argue that you are more agile by having these things in place, and your innovation is not stifled. And I guess that, from Janine's presentation, comes back to corporate culture. Thank you for your time today. That's the end of our series. If you have any questions, please email them to me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. If you have any questions that are relevant to what I spoke about today, or anything that concerns you, please pick up the phone and give me a call. Thank you very much.